But there's a lot of people who are liabilities on society, and I don't think that's any kind of a justification for legalizing their murder.
Well, okay. I feel like you keep presupposing that it's murder, but
well, no, I'm saying
exactly. Abortion and murder are clearly different things.
If they are people, then it is murder. If they are not people, then it is not murder.
You are tuning in to the Multiversity, a podcast for higher dimensional education.
Join us as we explore philosophy, science, history, and the great unknown.
Today, we are going to be talking about abortion. In 1973, the U.S. Supreme Court decided the landmark case of Roe versus Wade, codifying abortion as a legal right in the United States based on the 14th Amendment constitutional right to privacy. This decision has been widely criticized, both on legal grounds. The decision has been considered a case of extreme judicial activism, and it has also been criticized on ethical grounds. The pro-choice versus pro-life debate rages on in the U.S. and around the world today. And now with Donald Trump as president and a conservatively stacked Supreme Court, abortion rights are facing many challenges. Notably, Georgia recently passed a heartbeat law banning abortions after 6 weeks and granting full human rights to fetuses. And Alabama is currently set to vote on a bill that would effectively ban abortion outright. These laws will undoubtedly be challenged in the Supreme Court soon, putting Roe versus Wade on shaky ground. So let's talk about abortion, the state of the law, the changes the law might go through soon, and the ethical context. What do you guys think?
Yeah, so I think what it kind of looks like is happening is Trump has kind of set the stage for the Supreme Court to reverse Roe v. Wade. And so it looks like some states, some Democratic states are moving to reduce restrictions on abortion, and some Republican states are moving to increase restrictions on abortion. And so this is kind of one of those, I think the way the Trump administration sees it is, well, abortion is really a states' rights type thing where, each state should be able to choose whether it wants, like what kinds of abortions and in what circumstances it wants to allow them. So that's kind of what it looks like the states are already moving to do. They're already moving into kind of diverging directions depending on basically along party lines. So yeah, things are getting interesting. And a lot of people are getting really, really angry about stuff that is happening in states that they don't live in.
It seems like maybe part of the reason people are getting so angry about states they don't live in is, and this is me talking about a country I don't live in, but it seems like a big part of the motivation for these laws is to challenge Roe v. Wade itself at a federal level. Because a lot of these laws that we were reading about, like the laws in Georgia, contravene Roe v. Wade. They criminalize first-term abortions, or some portion of first-term abortions, which are protected constitutionally under Roe v. Wade. So it seems that in passing those laws, it'll inevitably lead to a constitutional challenge on Roe v. Wade, which could lead to Roe v. Wade being overturned due to the composition of the Supreme Court right now.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly seems like the Georgia law blatantly violates Roe v. Wade.
And the proposed Alabama bill does as well. I mean, that affects abortion rights completely, not even after six weeks. Ohio also passed a heartbeat law, and they passed a bill they're looking at a bill that would ban insurance companies from covering any abortion if it's not like completely medically necessary for the mother. And they even included like a provision about ectopic pregnancies, and it's a whole controversial thing. I think part of this, though, it's not just for people who come down really strong on either side of this issue. I don't think most people see it as a states' rights issue, because opponents to abortion, pro-lifers, see abortion as murder. So obviously people living in Georgia care if murder is legal in Minnesota.
Yeah.
Because they care about the human beings in their view. And then on the pro-choice side, this is a fundamental human rights issue and women's rights issue to the privacy and self-determination over their own bodies. So obviously they care quite a bit as well.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of like when I guess the Emancipation Proclamation came out, or the Civil Rights Act was passed, or there's been a lot of kind of movements by the national government to deny states to make certain kinds of laws, and having it be a states' rights issue is it's kind of like the pro-life people are kind of like, well, no, why should we legalize? Why should some states be allowed to essentially legalize murder? And of course, pro-choicers are like, well, yeah, like why should we be, why should other people in other states be allowed to, why should legislators in other states be allowed to dictate what women do with their bodies? And so I can kind of see both sides of the issue.
Yeah, it's a pretty fundamental divide. I just wanted to back up too, because you mentioned Donald Trump, or you mentioned it becoming a states' rights issue, and under the Trump presidency, it's kind of coming back up. Trump explicitly said on his campaign that he was pro-life and that he would purposefully appoint Supreme Court justices that would be opposed to Roe versus Wade, and that's exactly what's happened. So that's why this is coming up now.
Right, exactly. It seems like having it be a states' rights issue would be that would be a favorable scenario for pro-lifers.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, because they're losing right now. Where they've been losing since Roe v. Wade.
Exactly.
Yeah, and not just like losing a game for them. It's millions of babies being murdered every year that Roe versus Wade stands. So it's dicey.
Yeah, I mean, so I guess the big question is, and basically whether you're pro-choice or pro-life basically hinges on at what point you think that the child becomes a human being. Is it, at the moment that the child is born? Is it sometime before that? Is it when the child can feel pain? Is it when the child has a heartbeat? Is it when
you're calling it a child is kind of presuming a certain orientation towards it.
I don't know what I can call it without picking a side.
Yeah, I mean, well, if you call it a fetus,
baby, can we call it an unborn baby?
And if you say a pro-lifer would generally say unborn baby, a child, a baby, and then a pro-choicer is going to say a fetus, a zygote, a bundle of cells,
a pre-baby, like.
Well, it's in medical terms, it's generally referred to as an embryo before 8 weeks and as a fetus after 8 weeks.
Okay.
So embryo or fetus.
Okay. So, what was I was saying something though about that. Yeah. So when does the fetus become a human? Is a fetus a human, I guess?
Is a fetus a human with individual rights? And second question, do the rights of the fetus or the baby trump the rights of the mother to their own body?
And this is especially relevant now because part of what the Georgia bill will do is make it so that the fetus/embryo is considered to be a human being. You're considered to be a person in Georgia law, so they'd be counted on the census and stuff like that.
Yeah. So that has interesting ramifications because, of course, then killing the fetus is the same thing as murder. And apparently the penalties for murder in Georgia are very harsh. Apparently, I guess the two sentences that you can get are life in prison or the death penalty. And so some people are saying that now a woman who aborts a child could be subject to those penalties. There was another article that was written by a conservative that said, well, that isn't the case. It wouldn't be the woman who was punished. It would be her provider. that would be punished. So I'm not a legal expert, so I don't really know which of those is correct, but it seems to me that it's kind of widely able to be, it's able to be interpreted in a wide array of different ways. And it's kind of hard to predict how courts will rule when this inevitably comes before them.
Yeah. There's a Slate article that was written. It came out on May 7th, and that was passed around quite a bit. I saw it all over Facebook, Reddit, and it's pretty sensational. That's actually what inspired me to want to look into this more. And it was titled, "Georgia just criminalized abortion. Women who terminate their pregnancies would receive life in prison." And in this article, it claims that because the new Georgia law establishes fetuses post heartbeat, which is like 5 or 6 weeks, as human beings under the law, that human beings can be murdered. Murder laws would apply. Women could potentially face life in prison if they terminate, or the death penalty. And then, not to mention, you could end up being charged with conspiracy to murder if you plotted to abort and even left the state. That's what this article is claiming. Conservative articles and the governor of Georgia have completely denied this. They say that the law, as it's written, does not repeal previous codes or statutes which made abortion, basically put the liability for abortion on the doctor or the provider, or require a third party. But it does seem a little bit unclear, because this whole personhood thing could maybe be interpreted in different ways.
What do you make of all this?
I am skeptical that we're going to see women facing lifetime prison sentences for abortion anytime soon. I think that even if the law could legally be interpreted that way, I don't know that the public would stand for that. I think that would be challenged and probably go down. But I think it's almost certain that we're going to see Roe versus Wade go down in the next couple of years. So the Georgia law goes into effect in 2020, and most, at least from what I've read, a lot of people think it's probably going to be challenged all the way up to the Supreme Court before then. And I think you'll probably see Roe versus Wade be struck down and regulation of abortion go to the states. Meaning that basically every Republican state is going to ban it, at least after the first trimester, if not outright.
Wow. Yeah, that law that, the Alabama law that basically banning all abortions wholesale and banning those types of birth control that prevent the implantation of the zygote. Like, that's great. That's just crazy too.
It would ban the morning after pill.
Yeah.
Yeah. Basically, a lot of people view, especially religious people, view life starts at the point of conception, and life is sacred from the point of conception. So if you really believe that, then you have to go all the way to banning certain forms of birth control and banning the morning after pill. Otherwise, you're advocating murder in that view. How controversial is this in Canada? How controversial are abortion rights in Canada?
Far less controversial. There's still anti-abortion protesters and stuff like that, but they're really not happy because in Canada, there aren't any abortion laws. So everything is permitted. Because like Canada is actually the only country in the world that has no laws around abortion. No laws regulating it. Yeah.
And with that, do you see or hear about cases of fetuses or babies being aborted, or like very, very late, like at 9 months even?
The claim is that women don't carry out late-term abortions unless there's an important reason for doing so. that women will only carry out late-term abortions if there's a serious risk to her health, or that often what they'll say is that women only carry out late-term abortions if there's like, they discover that like the baby has some kind of illness or condition where it's going to die shortly after birth or something. And so then instead of going through that process, they get a late-term abortion. And that's kind of the argument for some of these laws in New York that are loosening the laws around late-term abortions. But I actually don't know the data. I think it's a hard thing to study.
Yeah, that's tough. Well, late-term abortions are legal in several states if there's medical necessity. It's just that I think it was in New York, it previously required 3 doctors to sign off on it being necessary. And
Right.
yeah, and then they removed those restrictions. That, in my opinion, is a little bit scary too. Like I'll come out and say, because it's relevant, I'm pro-choice, or I think I could be considered pro-choice. I'm pro-choice like 100% in the first trimester. I can understand why there's controversy around the second trimester, and then in the third trimester it gets a little bit hairy for me unless there's serious medical concerns.
Right.
Yeah. And I think that it bothers me that on the left and on the right, it doesn't seem like mainstream media wants to characterize the arguments of the other side properly.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, anybody, not anybody, but if you're pro-choice, the narrative is Republican men want to legislate women's bodies so that they can control women in some kind of a puritanical way. They completely ignore that about 40% of women in the US are pro-life.
Right.
And that I really don't think that this is an issue about Republicans just wanting to control women's bodies.
Yeah, they believe that it's really a human being, or I mean, not a human. They believe it's a person, that it has personhood, like the fetus or embryo.
Right. And obviously, a fetus has human DNA, is human, can't be considered anything but human, but is it a person with human rights that's deserving of ethical consideration, and at what point?
I mean, from my perspective, it's not even, I don't even know that that's the issue that it hinges on, for what I can tell. I almost don't think that the personhood of the fetus or embryo is really what the debate hinges on ethically for me. Because there's an argument that no one is ever obliged to give their body to another, or to sacrifice parts of their body for another unwillingly. So like, you know, if you had some kind of illness where it was like, you're only going to survive if I give you my kidney, then I wouldn't have a moral obligation to give you my kidney, and you wouldn't have the moral right to forcibly remove my kidney. It would be my decision whether or not to do it, even no matter how important it was to you, even if it was life or death to you and it was not life or death for me. That's the idea behind bodily autonomy.
This is the same argument that Rothbard makes, actually, in For a New Liberty. Basically, the fetus's life is dependent on the mother's life, and so the fetus is essentially a parasite on the mother. And so, if this were any other situation, then the mother would have the right to self-defense, basically.
So I've heard this argument. I don't think that the metaphor completely holds up. There's a very famous essay on this. I forget exactly what it's called, but it proposes a thought experiment of a comatose violinist, and you wake up and you find yourself hooked up to this violinist, and he's got a bunch of fans, and they tell you like, we're really sorry about this, but you're hooked up. The only way that you can survive is if you stay hooked up to this violinist for 9 months, and then he'll survive, and then it'll be over. And it's the question of, do you morally have to stay attached to this person? And I think in that case, the answer is, of course, no. But it's not an exact metaphor for a few reasons. One, because unless it's a case of rape, you're the one who put the fetus in that situation. You created them inside you. So it's kind of like, then it becomes a question of, do you take on obligation to deal with pregnancy if you have sex? But you could make a metaphor that also has issues of, say, you invited somebody up into your hot air balloon, and then like partway through the ride, you're like, hey, I don't want you on my property anymore. And then you throw them out. I don't think you can do that. I don't think that you have total eviction rights when evicting the person means that you're going to kill them. But I also understand that having sex isn't necessarily inviting a person, and I don't consider an early embryo or fetus to be a person. So it is complicated, but I don't think that metaphor works 100%, especially if you've let it go on to late term. It's kind of like, why? It's kind of like that hot air balloon scenario. Like you could have kicked them out when they were 5 or 10 feet off the ground and it wouldn't affect them so much. Maybe that's not exactly the right metaphor, because it would still kill the baby, but the baby wouldn't feel anything at that point. They have no consciousness. They're really arguably not a person, but instead you waited until there's really a being that can be harmed here, and you're just trying to claim that their personhood is not relevant to the situation. I don't think it's valid.
Well, I mean, again, when it comes to like late-term abortions, I think it's complicated because late-term abortions are pretty rare in Canada and other, I don't know about the United States, places where they're legal, but they're much more rare than second-term abortions, and they very often are spurred. The case is always, I don't know if it's always or not, but the case is the overwhelming majority of the time they're spurred because something is discovered in the third term that could not have been discovered sooner. Like there's illnesses where the baby's going to be born without lungs or something. Like the baby's going to be born in such a way that they're going to like immediately die outside the womb. And then instead of going through the process of giving birth to the baby and watching it die, they have a late term abortion. And so I think that's like you could make arguments around that, but I think it's a bit of a different moral question. And I think that context does have to be taken into account when discussing late term abortions.
I agree with you. And I do feel like late term abortions in the case of severe medical risk, or like the baby's going to have severe disability, I think those abortions are justified. But I think that the argument tends to get muddied because people who are 100% pro-choice use the example of people who are using late-term abortions to abort somebody with, say, microencephaly or some really severe genetic disease, or where the mother's life is 100% at risk. They use that argument to then justify late-term abortions 100%. And it is extremely rare. It's hard to find the numbers. I don't know if there are numbers even collected on how many elective late-term abortions there are, but the number of late-term abortions in general is really small. Maybe the argument shouldn't even hinge around that because the number is really small, but
yeah, like morally, I would definitely agree. I'd have a moral problem with elective late-term abortions for non-medical reasons for sure. But I think part of the issue is like legislatively, it's that's the argument they're making in New York now, is that it's hard to craft a law such that it allows all the like situations where we would feel like justified, or where someone probably like you and I would feel justified saying like, yes, a late-term abortion is okay because the baby has microencephaly, or the baby has like this disease where they're missing a heart, or like there's some whatever. It's hard, like, because it becomes very medical, so it's hard to craft that into law. And so I think that's often the argument for just making it completely legal. But I get that argument can be flawed. It might be flawed. So.
Right. And that's why they usually just say, in a lot of these bills, they just say, well, there should be a physician, or there should be, 2 or 3 physicians or something like that, who all have to agree that the abortion is the correct thing to do, and then you do it. And so I guess some people think that 3 physicians is too many, or that 1 is not enough. So, but yeah, I think generally if you have 2 physicians who are like, yeah, this abortion is totally medically necessary, then that's a pretty reliable indicator that it's medically necessary.
For sure. And I think like to your point, Katie, like to your point about kicking someone out, it would involve killing them. And with late-term abortions, like there is an argument that passive viability abortion shouldn't be allowed, or passive viability, the mother should just have to give birth to the baby. instead of getting, because it can survive us. If it can survive outside the womb, even if you're using that argument that the mother has full control of her bodily autonomy and she shouldn't have to remain pregnant, you can make the argument that she doesn't have the right to determine the life status of the fetus / baby.
I think it's very difficult to argue that if the fetus or baby at that point is viable, that you'd have the right to kill it as opposed to deliver it. Because I mean, at that point, once a fetus is viable, the process of abortion physically is very similar to an induced labor anyway. It's just you're killing them during the process.
Yeah, unless it's like really sick though. Like if it is going to be really sick, like because then you'd almost like, it's almost like there's no easy or consistent moral answer, because it's either you say you have to give birth to it even though it's really sick and it's going to like die over the next 2.5 months in an incubator or whatever, or you have to just say, in this case, the mother does have the right to make this moral judgment that we're withholding in other cases.
So
go ahead.
What were you going to say, Katie?
I was going to say, I think that brings up a different issue, which is that we as a society don't like to talk about euthanasia. And in the case of abortion, before the baby is born, I think it's easier for us to allow for what essentially is euthanasia. I mean, if you have a fetus who's post the point of viability, but has some kind of a disease where they're going to wither away in a few months and die very painfully, aborting them at that point, in my opinion, is morally equivalent to euthanasia. It's just that we as a society are comfortable with euthanasia when we can say that it's an abortion, because then we can continue to avoid the issue of euthanasia when it's not an abortion.
Well, and euthanasia is generally like up to the person, right? Like you get the person's consent and you say, like, do you want to die? And they go yes, and they sign a form, and maybe they sign a lot of forms, and maybe the family has to consent too, or maybe the family is only asked if they're in a coma or something like that. I'm not sure. Yeah, basically the difference would be that you get their consent, and there's obviously no way to get the fetus's consent. But I want to back up a little bit and just talk about the kinds of arguments that you can make about abortion, kinds of moral arguments. I think you can make first principles arguments like you guys have been making mostly, which is, well, at what point does the fetus become human? And, at what point is it going to be viable, outside of the mother? And those are kind of like first principles questions, because you're talking about like, is it murder to do this? And obviously we know that murder is wrong. And we should never allow that in our society. And so, we should figure out, when it would be murder and when it wouldn't be murder, and just draw the line there. But the other class of arguments that can be made are consequentialist arguments, like arguments from consequences. Or I'm not sure if that's the same thing. A consequentialist moral arguments, which is, well, since it's kind of confusing whether when the baby actually becomes a human, or when the fetus actually becomes human, maybe we can talk about the consequences of abortion and the consequences of allowing, and I think this is what a lot of pro-choice people do, is they talk about, well, if you don't allow abortion, then basically you're going to end up with all of these kind of single mothers who didn't want those kids, and those kids are going to grow up having very rough lives, and it seems reasonable to predict that those kids are going to be actually a liability on society rather than an asset. And of course, it's horrible to make that call, but it seems to me a pretty good argument that if the parents don't want the kid, it's very unlikely that the kid will be like this huge asset for society. But I guess pro-lifers would say that's probably really evil sounding, you know.
I'm a pro-choicer, and that's really evil sounding to me. But, well, okay, so I mean,
but a lot of pro-choicers say this. They say, you know, basically criminality goes through the roof when you, or criminality goes down as a result of allowing women to have abortions.
That's the Freakonomics argument. But, you know, he basically said that Roe v. Wade, because crime rates went way down in the 1990s. So the Freakonomics guy argued that Roe v. Wade, legalizing abortion in the 70s, basically reduced the criminal generation 20 years later in the 90s. But his numbers are so sketchy. He's like a lot of people have really questioned his numbers. It's a very, very the argument rests on shaky ground.
It seemed to be a decent argument, though. I read it, and I haven't read all the criticisms, but it wasn't just Roe v. Wade. He also traced the numbers and looked at the crime rates, and when they started going down in other states that passed that legalized abortion sooner, and it seemed to correlate. Maybe it wasn't a good study, but it wasn't just based on Roe v. Wade.
Well, and the interesting thing about what's happening
his numbers
now
have been criticized, though, like just on a purely research level, like the way he used statistics.
Okay.
So the interesting thing that's happening right now is that if we go back to this sort of states' rights model, where abortion it's allowed to ban abortion, then at that point, I mean, people are freaking out about this, but it'll allow us to actually collect a lot better data on what happens when you allow some states to ban abortion and some states to have abortion. So maybe this could end up being a positive thing.
Yeah, I think it's morally very sketchy to talk about whether or not it's okay to kill humans on consequentialist grounds. Like for me personally, I know that we haven't really gone into the debate of when a fetus becomes a human being worthy of moral consideration. And I know for Ariel, that's not your main sticking point. It's more about is the mother obligated to support another life, regardless of if they are a human life. But for me, it does really rest on, is the fetus an individual that should have human rights, and how do we evaluate that question? For me, that is where it rests. And if you're talking to people who believe that this is a human being, that a fetus is a baby is a human being, then the idea that this human being is statistically more likely to become a criminal because they have shitty parents, so we should kill them, is a really abhorrent argument, and I don't think it's going to be effective.
The argument is, if there's nobody to take care of the baby, and basically nobody wants to take care of the baby, then yeah, like society cannot support that. That's not something that if you take into an extreme, then yeah, you just end up with all of these children that society doesn't have the resources to care for.
There's always a waiting list for newborn adoptions in the US.
Yeah, but I mean, a lot of the times, a lot of babies that are aborted are babies that are not desirable candidates for adoption, like babies with fetal alcohol syndrome or babies with Down syndrome.
Yeah, this is true. Even still, though, I don't think that the argument that these babies would be a liability to society is an argument that would convince anyone who is pro-life. And I also don't think that it's a good ethical road for us to go down, because then there's a lot of people. There's a lot of people who are liabilities on society, and I don't think that's any kind of a justification for legalizing their murder.
Well, okay.
Right.
Okay. I feel like, Katie, you keep presupposing that it's murder, but.
Well, no, I'm saying
abortion and murder are clearly different things.
If they are people, then it is murder. If they are not people, then it is not murder. That's where I'm saying the argument changes.
Yeah, I think the line is certainly
murder has inherently blurry boundaries, because if it's self-defense, then that's not considered murder. So is it killing a human life? Yes. And should we avoid that? Yes. But are there circumstances where ending a human life is morally acceptable? Absolutely. And so I would argue that murder and abortion are maybe sort of different parts of the spectrum. And maybe even there's a pretty clear line between them.
So to build on, I just want to, before we move on to the topic of if it's when a fetus or embryo becomes a person or not, to build on what Chris was saying, I want to add like another consequentialist argument that people bring up a lot, probably more commonly, is this argument that legalizing abortion improves the conditions of women in society because it allows women more freedom over the course of their lives. And so you see, it's hard to say exactly, but it does seem to be correlated to higher educational attainment for women and things like that.
Well, the pro-lifers would say, well, just use a condom, or don't have premarital sex, I guess, or don't have premarital sex, yeah. Or if you do, then use a condom or some kind of contraception.
But I mean that that's an individualistic response. But I was making a consequentialist high level argument, right? Like you kind of like what you were making, Chris, like looking at it from far above, where what are the long term consequences of legalizing abortion? What are the long term consequences of criminalizing it? We can probably come up with, like society, like pros and cons. That society looks very different either way. And just one argument that pro choice people bring up a lot, which maybe might not convince you, Katie, if you were to be convinced that it's murder, you probably would not be convinced by this. But one argument that is compelling to a lot of pro-choice people is this idea that the lot of women improves when abortion is legal.
I think that's true. So I am pro-choice. I don't consider abortion to be murder, but I'm trying to take the perspective of a pro-lifer. But okay, if we're going to go down this consequentialist route, I think that, yeah, abortion rights do improve the conditions of women. Almost certainly. It takes something that's like a life-changing event and turns it into a choice, where if you're a high school student or a college student or working a job and young, if you get pregnant and you don't have the option to abort and you don't want to give the child up for adoption, then that's going to completely derail and change the course of your entire life. And that ends up happening to a lot of women. And when abortion rights are in place, that's not necessarily the case.
And that's kind of like, it gets back to your argument before, Katie, where you were talking about like part of the reason you don't find the parasite argument convincing, this idea that the fetus or the embryo is, regardless of whether it's a person or not, the woman does not have an obligation to host it in her body. You said the reason you didn't find it convincing was because in some way the woman had invited the embryo into her body. And I think, I would ask, one question I would have for you is, well, how would you evaluate like underage pregnancy? Like if someone is like, we don't generally consider underage people to be fully responsible for their actions the way we do adults.
That's a good point. The invitation thing is shaky either way, because I don't think that women are necessarily inviting pregnancy by having sex. But especially in the case of young people who can't really fully understand the consequences, don't have the forward thinking skills to understand the consequences, don't have the impulse control, it's a very different situation. Maybe it's more like this. Maybe a better analogy than you inviting somebody up in your hot air balloon is somebody breaks into your hot air balloon or just jumps in and is in there, and they're in there, and you could kick them out while you're still on the ground or while you're a little bit off the ground, but instead you wait to kick them out until you're all the way up in the air.
That's a good analogy.
I mean, I think that would maybe apply to third-term abortions, I guess.
And second term, maybe.
But you don't always find out. You don't always find out you're pregnant, like 4 weeks after conception.
Yeah.
When
gradual.
are you first able to, like, what's the earliest that you would be able to just like get one of those pregnancy tests and test positive?
The earliest that you could get a pregnancy test and test positive is a few days before your missed period. So it would be within the first month. However, you might not necessarily know. Not all women have regular periods. So a lot of women who don't have regular periods, especially if you're young, you probably don't have regular periods. So you might not have any indication that you're pregnant until you miss a few months in a row, or you start showing in some cases.
And if you haven't missed a period yet, because these heartbeat bills would forbid abortion after 6 weeks, which is right around when the missed period is, because they're counting it from the previous period that took place before the pregnancy.
Oh, they're counting it from the previous period that took place before the pregnancy?
Yeah, that's where that's just what gestational age means.
Okay. Well, the average menstrual cycle is 28 days.
Yeah, so the 6 weeks is actually 4 weeks after conception. So so that's right around when the missed period is. And if you haven't even missed the period yet, you have no reason usually to even get a pregnancy test.
Well, to be fair, the missed period for most women would be around 2 weeks after conception. It would be around 2 weeks after ovulation.
Yeah,
the average cycle is 28 days, and if you're above 35 days, then it starts to be like abnormal.
Can they really do pregnancy tests that soon, within 2 weeks of conception? Hang on.
Yeah, you can do pregnancy tests up to a little bit before your missed period is when. I've had some pregnancy scares in my lifetime. I know.
I know, you're right. It's 2 weeks after conception. Huh.
Yeah.
So to go back to the hot air balloon analogy, if you so somebody jumps into your hot air balloon and you don't realize that they're there, and you don't take any kind of test to figure out that they're there until they're really, really high up, and then suddenly you're like, whoa, somebody's all the way up there in my hot air balloon. I'm not sure where I'm going with this.
I guess it's a question, are they a threat to you? Or is it like, no, whoa, man, I don't want to hurt you. I was just taking a nap here. It's like some dirty hippie that you don't really want there, but...
Right. Basically, it's somebody that you have to take care of for a long time. Otherwise, they're going to suck at life and probably drag a bunch of other people down with them.
Even bringing it to birth, like even just going through a pregnancy is like...
It's a lot.
It's a really intense thing to have to go through, and it permanently warps your body. I mean, I'm not saying that should be the only ethical consideration or anything, but like, God.
Yeah, it permanently warps your body. It permanently changes your brain.
It temporarily changes your brain.
Temporarily. Does it go back completely to normal?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, while you're pregnant, to clarify for the audience, while you're pregnant, your brain shrinks and you become less intelligent. It goes back to normal after, though.
Wow. Okay, so it temporarily changes your brain. It permanently changes your body. It's an extremely painful, uncomfortable, disruptive experience overall during, and then, of course, childbirth, which is an ordeal. Not to mention, it is risky. It's not extremely risky with modern medical science, but it is risky.
It just seems like it would be somehow like so terrible to go through childbirth unwillingly. Like, it's one thing if you're like, yes, I really want a baby and I'm going to go through the miracle of life. But it's another thing if it's like, I would have gotten an abortion, but it's like illegal here, wherever I live. So I'm doing this. Like it just seems like it's just so much more like there's something like traumatic about that.
There is something extremely traumatic about it.
So another consequentialist argument around abortion that comes up a lot is the idea that when you criminalize abortion, abortions happen anyway. But illegal abortions are much less safe and pose a much greater threat to the health and safety of the woman.
This is a real problem. Yeah, that's definitely a real issue. Like, well, in Mexico, abortion is illegal in a lot of different parts of Mexico, but anecdotally, at least, I know several women who have had abortions and they just end up ordering pills online, which probably are pretty safe. Like, you're pretty sure that you're actually getting what you think you're getting, but you can't be 100% sure. And then it's like you feel uncomfortable to go to a doctor and you're not monitored while you're going through that induced miscarriage process. Complications can happen, and then you may feel obligated to lie about what was going on if you need to go to the hospital. So you're more likely to stay home.
Yeah, and this is another reason why I'm partial to the pro-choice side a little bit, just because, like, if somebody wants to have an abortion, especially if they catch it early on, then I mean, don't ban it, because they're still going to do it anyway.
Yeah. I mean, I guess if you were really viewing it in terms of like the life of the fetus is paramount, it is likely that there would still be fewer abortions if it was criminalized.
Yeah, that's also
legal abortions, but there would be fewer total abortions. There would be more women endangering and harming their health. But if you consider the woman's life to be equivalent to the life of the fetus, then a purely utilitarian calculus from a pro-life perspective might still say it's worth it.
Yeah,
right.
And also it would be, if you consider the fetus to be a human being, then it's a murderer endangering their life in the course of murder from that perspective. I just want to be clear, I don't actually consider it murder, but many do.
And I guess this kind of reminds me of drug laws. Like if you ban people from using drugs, they're still going to use drugs. And they're just going to do it in a less safe way. But clearly the point of drug laws is to try and deter people from doing that. And so this is what abortion bans are doing. They're trying to deter people from having, premarital sex or from having abortions, So does it work as a deterrent? Probably not.
There's some evidence that
maybe if you might get the death penalty.
There is some evidence that when you criminalize things, it becomes less common than when you make it legal. Like when you make drugs illegal, people still do drugs, but they do fewer drugs. Or they do drugs less frequently. Or when you make prostitution illegal, it becomes less common, even though it still happens.
I think
you're also reducing access to abortion, even if it's not about the deterrent of the possible legal consequences. For a lot of women, the possible health consequences of an illegal abortion would be enough of a deterrent, and you're making access more difficult because you have to get pills online or do like a coat hanger thing or,
Yeah, I mean, at least, the pills are a new thing, right? Like they're relatively new technology.
The pills are a relatively new technology. Those were not available in like the 60s and early 70s before Roe v. Wade.
I mean, again, it's just sad. Like, it's just sad to like imagine women going through that like alone with like pills or.
Yeah, well, and two, we should note that a lot of legal abortions in the first trimester happen with pills, and one of the big advantages of the pills is they can be taken at home. It's just, if they're illegal, then maybe you're ending up getting kind of sketchy pills, and if there are complications, then you might be deterred from going to the hospital.
Yeah, and I think what we were reading is there's two kinds of pills, and there's one that's relatively easy to access illegally, and there's one that's difficult to access illegally, but ideally for optimal health benefits, you would take both.
Yes.
Yeah. My general position is pretty libertarian. It's basically, if you ban stuff, then you don't allow anybody to come up with a solution to the problems that might happen. But if you allow behavior, then as the problems arise, the private companies come up with solutions, gradually over the course of time until the situation becomes no longer a bad thing.
I mean, I don't know. I think there are reasons to ban things, like something like slavery, like banning slavery. It's a moral victory for a society to ban slavery. It's basically a society saying, regardless of the consequences, we're not going to stand for this and we're not going to condone this. And I would argue in some cases, in that case, banning was clearly the right course of action.
Again, this is why it's my view that the fundamental question about abortion is whether or not the fetus is a human being worthy of human rights.
Yeah, and this is again why I just go to the consequentialist arguments, because those are the only Those are the only arguments that seem to be able to look at data and use that.
I think it's somewhere in the middle. And some you got to take into account first principles and consequences and a lot of different factors. And there are first principles aside from the whatever personhood status you grant on the fetus.
I
don't think that can be the only factor.
I don't think it's the only factor, but for me, it's the hinge factor. Other arguments might bolster it.
I mean, it's not though. As you even acknowledged that before, that even if you consider the fetus a full human being, you'd still consider abortion to be permissible in cases where the pregnancy was completely involuntary on the part of the woman.
Well, yeah, because then the analogy of being hooked up to a violinist, like we talked about before, would apply. But
Yeah.
I don't think that analogy does apply if we're talking about a voluntary situation. Not fully. Right? The pregnancy is somewhere in between voluntary and involuntary. It's unintended and it's unlikely.
It's still a major factor though.
Yeah.
Like the fact that the woman's body is going towards incubating this other being is still a major factor in determining the ethics of whether she should be forced to incubate it or not.
I guess it is. Maybe it is. The nice thing, or I don't want to say nice because this is just an ugly issue, but one thing that's nice is that those two things align. You don't really have to ask much of the question. Well, you can ask the question, but the evidence indicates that consciousness doesn't happen until very far down the line when the fetus would be basically viable anyway. So no matter which angle you're coming at it from these first principles, it kind of aligns.
And unless consciousness isn't the determining factor for you. But
yeah, if the determining factor for you is conception and a soul, then...
Or if it's a full human genome, a full unique human genome, then you do have to consider it at conception.
Yeah. And at
Good
that
point.
I don't think that a genome, a full human genome, is a morally relevant factor, but
it is if you're focusing on the potential argument.
Well, but then I mean, then you have to take into account. Then you also have to talk about the people who had sex to make the human genome too, because, right. And then you have to talk about. There's a lot of moral issues surrounding just procreation.
Yeah, if you're only taking into account the potential argument, then you end up like the Catholic Church opposed to condom use.
No, because you can say,
well, a sperm has the potential to fertilize an egg, and so killing a sperm, like masturbating in the toilet, would be. If a guy did that would be like.
Yeah, well,
really immoral.
Usually the potential argument comes down to something like the natural course of this, if you didn't intervene, would be for it to develop into a human being. And abortion or the morning after pill could be considered one form of intervention, but I would argue that a barrier method is also a form of intervention. If you didn't have a condom, a barrier in between the sperm and the egg, then the sperm and the egg would have naturally collided in that scenario. And also you can take it back even further to like, are we obligated to have sex every month? I don't think anybody really takes it that far, but some people do take the potential argument all the way to the point of
you can definitely take the potential argument to an absurd place.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah, and that's where Zizek says that God is the greatest abortionist. Because so much genetic material is being destroyed all the time. But I mean,
Okay, here's another point.
Yeah.
Approximately 25% of known pregnancies miscarry.
Uh,
So when we're talking about early term abortion, we're talking about causing something to happen, which happens probably over a quarter of the time anyway.
Are you serious?
Yes.
Quarter of this is global statistics or U.S. statistics?
I think it's U.S. Let me look it up.
I would imagine global, because I can't imagine it's that high in the U.S.
it actually wouldn't surprise me if that was high. There's actually like a custom. A lot of women don't announce their pregnancies until after the first term because the miscarriage is so common.
Talking about miscarriage is kind of a taboo, but
Wow.
if you talk to women
no idea.
individually, most women I know who have had children have had miscarriages, if not multiple miscarriages.
Yeah, I've personally known women who have had miscarriages.
Yeah, I have to.
Yeah.
It's another crazy thing about some of these laws. They say might make it so that a woman is like under investigation for miscarrying.
See, okay,
Well,
so
yeah,
it's a
apparently
little
this-
bit
this
disputed.
pill
Studies
that-
reveal that anywhere between 10 to 25% of all clinically recognized pregnancies and miscarriage. Another source says 10 to 15% of pregnancies end before the 12th week of pregnancy, and another 1 to 5% of pregnancies end in the second trimester.
Yeah, apparently this pill that you can eat, and it basically, like, really reliably causes an abortion. And a woman can do it on her own. Unless it's somehow investigated, it's indistinguishable from a miscarriage. It's just a regular miscarriage.
Right. Unless it
So-
was investigated. And the Georgia law would allow for women to, or at least some people think it would allow for women to be investigated to see if their miscarriage was actually a miscarriage or an abortion. That's one of the issues of banning abortion really early also, is it opens up potential prosecution for miscarriages, which so many women have.
That's really scary. And those kinds of laws are really scary, right? Like that, like Zizek calls that one of the great markers of totalitarianism, is when you have laws that can be applied to large swaths of the population at the pleasure of the government, let's say.
Yeah, I mean,
Right.
that new law from Georgia, as interpreted by like Slate or whatever, it sounds like something out of the Middle East, like Saudi Arabia or something, and maybe even worse. I don't know what they believe about abortion over there, but like
Abortion laws in the Middle
put
East
people to death for
be more
moving to
liberal.
another state and eating a pill, and yeah.
Sometimes Middle Eastern laws are surprising because they have different.
They have a different moral framework going on.
Yeah, exactly. Let's see in Saudi Arabia what the abortion laws are.
Anyway, it'd be great if we could.
Saudi Arabia. Illegal with only a very narrow exception, only legal if the abortion will save a woman's life or if the pregnancy gravely endangers the woman's physical or mental health. The fetus must be less than 4 months old, and if longer, requires a panel of approved specialists to declare that any pregnancy will result in the death of the woman. Yeah, so basically it's only allowed if the woman's going to die.
Sounds like Georgia
Or severe mental health. Yeah, it's about
or
the same.
Alabama, maybe. I think
It actually is
Alabama.
it actually is similar to the Georgia law.
That'd be so interesting if like that
little
would
bit
really
more
piss
restrictive.
them off if you were just like, yeah, this sounds exactly like Saudi Arabia. They'd be like, we're not Muslims.
Saudi Arabia is a little bit more restrictive because in Georgia they would allow elective abortions up until 6 weeks.
Right. Okay.
It's more similar to Alabama.
Yeah, Alabama.
Alabama's
would
not
be-
passed yet, but the potential Alabama bill would be equivalent.
Yeah, it would be no better than Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, but imagine what people from Alabama would think about you saying that. They'd be like, "We hate everybody from the Middle East. Don't allow them in this country." And it's like they're gonna implement Sharia law, and it's like you're doing that.
Maybe this will be the unifying issue where Christians and Muslims will realize that they're both people of the book and unite to create a theocracy in America.
Yay, multiculturalism.
So I don't think that we can boil down the abortion debate, like the ethics of abortion, to one single factor. I think there's a lot of factors that are important to at least some people, and it's probably a combination of both, or of all of them. You have, is it a woman's responsibility to support a fetus to term, even if it is a human? Do you have to take care of this human being? It's a question of, when is this a human being that has individual rights? Because if you think that you are obligated, then that's an important question. It's okay, so there's those questions. There's the consequentialist questions as well. Are there any other factors that tend to come up in this? I mean, there's sanctity of life and kind of religious questions about it, but I don't think we're going to get into that.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, a lot of conservative Christians just say, well, my religion teaches that, all life is sacred, and therefore, contraception is evil. And, basically from the moment of conception, the baby is a baby, and killing it after that is highly immoral, because it has a soul.
Other arguments I could think of, it may be like not messing with fate or nature. That could be one I could see. It's almost like there's like a transhumanist element to abortion, and I could see people being like,
I think that's a related argument.
Yeah, it's a related
argument,
argument, but it's still distinct.
I think one of the most common secular arguments against abortion, like at any level, is the argument that the value of human life is in its potential, and by aborting, you're robbing someone of their potential.
Or you're robbing society of a source of potential.
Mm-hmm. So my personal take, and it would be interesting to have you guys tear it apart, is that for me, I consider abortion morally acceptable up to the point where the fetus becomes an individual. And I know that's hard to define biologically, but the way that I try to define that is when they're conscious, like when they have their own unique experience. Then I think that they're a being that's deserving of ethical consideration and rights. And I did a bunch of research on this years ago and tried to figure out like when does the sensory system connect to the central nervous system? And that seems to be somewhere between 20 and 24 weeks, which is right around.
Well, and I think it's a related. I know you did a lot of research on like veganism, and like I think it's a related question, because it's like, when does the life begin to feel pain? When does it start to feel suffering? When does it have a subjective experience, however rudimentary?
Abortion issues and animal issues are really linked for me.
Why is that the determining factor?
For me, that's the clearest line that I can draw for when someone becomes an individual, is when there's a separate consciousness. I think that's what it boils down to, because
when something becomes someone.
Exactly. When there is someone to be considered. Another way to frame this is, I don't think it's possible to harm someone that doesn't have an experience of being harmed, or someone that's not a someone. Like, from the perspective of the fetus, if they're aborted before they have any kind of consciousness whatsoever, then it's exactly the same as if they had never been conceived at all. There's like, based on continuity, like they have no experience. It's cut off before they have any consciousness of having ever existed. The someone, never existed. And so I think it's a conservative position.
Right, but then that assumes that consciousness is this discrete, discontinuous thing where at one moment you're not conscious and then the next moment you are conscious.
I don't think it is. I don't think it is discrete or continuous. I think it is kind of a flow, but it seemed like it starts to build up maybe between 20 to 24 weeks. So cut the barrier a couple weeks before we scientifically think it's possible, and then you're safe and you're still well into the second trimester and everybody's happy. Maybe not everybody's happy, but a lot of people are happy.
Yeah. So
a factor of safety in there.
Yeah. So you kind of have to be a vegan for this moral position to work. Hey,
you kind of do have to be a vegan for this moral position to work.
That's true.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. If you have this opinion about abortion, then you also have to be a vegan.
Unless you say there's something special about
Human
being
conscious.
conscious and being a human, that those are two necessary conditions.
Yeah, and I guess for our audience, like to know, I was a vegan for 3 years, and I was a vegan when I developed this argument, and then I had a bunch of health issues that I attributed to veganism, so I started eating some animal products, and once I got let go of the label, it's a lot easier to justify eating cheese at restaurants sometimes, but I don't feel great about that, so that's where I'm at. This was an argument developed when I was a vegan. It felt like my philosophy was totally consistent, and I'm just a big old hypocrite now. Yeah.
It's almost like individual choices require, or individual circumstances require consideration of all of the relevant details of those circumstances before being able to make the proper moral decision.
No. You can just generalize broadly across everything.
I mean, there are definitely some moral absolutes, right? I mean, definitely some things that we can say that we should just always do, right?
Yeah, I think so.
And they apply in all possible contexts.
I do think there are things like that. Or maybe there's just patterns that are universal, and then all the strictures for behavior emerge from them.
I think that there are some things that are okay. I think that you need to evaluate each situation on an individual level, but there are some categories that are so strongly morally abhorrent that in like 99.99999% of cases, you would evaluate them as morally wrong, so then it becomes an absolute. But then if you're talking about legality is discrete. You know, you have to set the boundaries.
Not exactly. Because there are courts, and courts are able to take into all of the facts of the case and decide on.
So there's the question.
We have courts.
Would you rather have a system that draws hard lines but draws them extremely precisely and tries to really, really not fuck it up, or do you want to give individual judges a lot of power?
This is interesting because this is actually the difference between the U.S. and Canada, because the U.S. is a republic based on the French system, kind of. So the U.S. is a system that sets broad, clear guidelines, but tries to do so very precisely and very carefully. Like you guys have a constitution and all these amendments and stuff like that, versus in Canada, we have a common law system, so parliamentary democracy. So it's much different. It's designed to be more flexible. Like the idea is that the law is based on custom and changes all the time to adapt to new circumstances. And so there's pros and cons.
The courts actually have a lot more power in that system, I would guess, to interpret the common law as they see fit.
There's still a Supreme Court and stuff like that, but the legislature has a lot more power. Basically, the democracy has more power. Like in a common law system, the laws are nested within the democracy. So it would be permissible in Canada. There's nothing preventing us from electing someone who is going to be completely anti-free speech and create like a police state. Like there are things preventing that, but the things that are preventing that are things that are also within the democracy and can be voted away, versus in the United States, the democracy is nested within the republic, and the republic sets out clear laws that are beyond the reach of the democracy.
Interesting. So it's a much more malleable legal system then.
We have a more malleable legal system in Canada than you guys have, yeah.
Right, yeah. So yeah, it seems like that type of a system is definitely much more prone to wild swings depending on the political climate.
See Bill C-16. Free speech isn't doing so well in Canada these days, but on the other hand, there's disadvantages to having the Republican system has its disadvantages as well.
Right, it's more rigid, so it won't necessarily. It's probably just more conservative in general. It just resists change.
Yeah, exactly. And you get issues where like some of these very strict constitutional laws that were put in place in the 1700s. Like some people feel that they're out of date, or it's hard to apply them to the modern age when so much has changed.
Yeah, I wonder if that's the reason why. Katie, you were showing me the political two-axis, political label system, and how the U.S. is kind of just to the right and slightly more authoritarian side of the center of that graph. Where the top
Both the
of the graph
Democrats and the Republicans are.
Exactly. Both ruling parties are like pretty much right there. Where the top of the graph is authoritarian, the bottom of the graph is libertarian, and the left is the left and the right is the right. Left being, I guess, more public ownership of property, and the right being more private ownership of property. Or I guess there's lots of ways to define left and right. But I wonder if this republic system that we have in the U.S. is what causes that kind of very, very rigid and slightly to the right position that the U.S. occupies on that graph.
Well, I think that the vast majority of liberal democracies today would also occupy that position, or right around the center, slightly to the right. Basically, that graph goes from authoritarian to libertarian, left and right, authoritarian, libertarian. It's kind of self-explanatory. Left is socialist, right is private property, like public property or communal property or no property versus private property. And the vast majority of countries today have a mildly authoritarian state that are some kind of mix of capitalism and socialism, but the main economic system is a market system. So not the vast majority of countries, but the vast majority of like developed industrialized countries would fall like right in that spot.
Yeah, it seems to me that, and maybe this is just a coincidence, but maybe it seems to me that a lot of those parliamentary democracies that Ariel was talking about are a bit more liberal than the U.S. just in general, and maybe that's a consequence of their political structure.
It's possible. It would allow populists to sway things more.
Yeah, I guess the way to get to the bottom of this would be to look at other republics, like France, and I don't know what other republics are, but the other republics, and see how, if they follow that pattern you're identifying, Chris.
Yeah. Anyway, so we're coming up on the end times here, the end of our live stream. Thank you everyone who joined us. Let's see. I guess let's have some final thoughts. Do you guys have anything? Any things that you didn't get to say that you really want to say?
I think we covered a lot. Oh, the one thing that I wanted to talk a little bit about that I didn't talk about, or that we didn't talk about. I don't know if you guys are up for one more topic, but I think that the question of Roe versus Wade as a constitutional question is kind of interesting, because it was the Supreme Court declared that abortion rights fall under the 14th Amendment right to privacy, which in my opinion and many people's opinions was a big stretch.
Yeah. There's a lot of laws like that in the U.S. There's a lot of Supreme Court decisions that are like that in the U.S. There, for instance, where it's just like this massive stretch in order to take away the rights of the states. An example of that would be the drug law, the Controlled Substances Act in 1971, yeah. They just completely banned a bunch of different substances under the Commerce Clause.
The Interstate Commerce Clause.
Yeah, exactly. Like it's interstate commerce. Yeah, and then they ruled that somebody in California who was growing a weed plant was conducting interstate commerce, and it was like, no, like clearly that is a bastardization of the Commerce Clause.
Yeah, there's definitely been some judicial overreach. Okay, so for the record, I'm pro-choice, and I don't want Roe versus Wade to be overturned, but I don't think that it's a valid constitutional decision either, or that it ever was.
In the U.S., there's different schools of legal thought, right? Like I forget what they're called, but there's some schools of legal thought, and different schools of legal thought take different stances towards the Constitution. Like some of them take stances that are much more like like some take stances that are like the Constitution should be interpreted in the spirit that the founders intended it, and others take the stance of more like the Constitution is subject to interpretation that can change with the times and stuff like that.
Yeah, I don't even see how Roe versus Wade could be construed as an interpretation of the Constitution.
I mean, so what the way that the framers of the Constitution intended was for the Constitution to be flexible. If some change needs to be made, you can put an amendment into the Constitution. That's the whole reason for constitutional amendments. Actually, this is going back to drug law. You notice that when they banned alcohol in the 1920s, they had to pass a constitutional amendment to do that, and they did. And then the results were so disastrous that they had to pass another amendment to repeal the First Amendment, that prohibited alcohol. But then somehow in the 1970s, we can just use the Commerce Clause, and it was like, how did that change? It was the Supreme Court. It's just, activist judges, I guess.
It didn't. Yeah. I think it's this activist thing where I would take a little bit of issue with your wording. Like the spirit of your wording was true, but I would say that the founding fathers intended for the Constitution to be changed if people wanted to do something outside the Constitution. So they created mechanisms for it to be able to be changed, but they also intended for it to be extremely difficult to change.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's really, really tough to pass a constitutional amendment, and for a good reason, because basically the Constitution limits the powers of government. And what happened in Roe versus Wade, and also what happened, or it limits the power of the federal government. What happened in Roe versus Wade and what happened with the drug laws in the 70s is, and more is judges are just thinking, well, okay, we want to do this. Let's look for a way that we can kind of sort of justify it with the Constitution, but it has nothing.
Like shoehorn it in somewhere random.
It clearly is just the decisions that the judges want to make, and they are trying to find some BS way to say that the Constitution justifies it.
I mean, it's interesting because it's the same kind of conflict that happens with religions in the modern day. You get a lot of different schools of religious interpretation around a religion, like especially the Abrahamic religions like Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, where there's aspects of the religion that are really hard to square with modern sensibilities. And then you get some schools of thought that are like, no, we should just stick to the religion as it's written, as it was intended, in a either literalistic or less literalistic way. And there's other people that are like, no, it's all interpretive, and this we can ignore these parts we don't like, or we can interpret them and to align with our, or they come up with like justifications to get their religion to square with kind of what they want to say is right today.
Yeah, and another analogy can be drawn to, wait for it, cryptocurrencies. So it's also known as self-executing constitutions.
There it is.
There you can change the rules, but you have to get consensus from most of the hash power. So they're designed to be extremely difficult to change, and when you design something like that, you're basically making a gamble that these are still going to be the conditions. These are still going to be successful rules. 100 years, 200 years, 1,000 years down the line. But if things get really bad, then, everybody can kind of agree, and then the rules get changed. But of course, the downside is that things have to get really bad first.
Yeah, it's interesting because some religions, kind of Islam and Judaism in particular, they have like almost consensus rules, like saying like this is how it should be interpreted and this is how things can be changed. Christianity doesn't have that so much, but because it's like they almost like learned like, okay, we have to have both the system and then we have to have the protocol for how the system can be changed and interpreted.
Yeah, I think a good system has mechanisms for the system to be changed. The issue is, I think a lot of people in the US are frustrated because they want to change things, but they know that not enough people are going to agree, so they're not going to be able to change things, so they just want to stomp all over the Constitution. But in my opinion, governments are dangerous in general, but if you're going to just ignore the the written limitations on government that were put in place when the government was founded, then it's really dangerous.
Right, exactly. I mean, it's kind of the argument that, all political conservatives, but especially kind of Jordan Peterson likes to make, where, yes, and maybe we should throw out some of these rules, but we do that at our peril because they've been around for hundreds of years and clearly helped us get where we are. So we should be really careful about doing that. We should certainly change them as they become obsolete, but we have to remember to study why they're there first and really, really, really understand why they're there.
I mean, it cuts both ways too. Like, one thing when I was reading the Wikipedia article on Roe v. Wade, I thought it was really interesting just the amount of work that seemed to go into that ruling. Like that guy, Justice Blackmun, he was reading about like abortion practices in ancient Greece and ancient Rome, and it seemed like, for all it was criticized, it did seem like it was well thought out from what I could tell, versus like some of these abortion laws that are being passed in places like Ohio now, where they're talking about medical procedures that don't even exist. Like one, like the bill in Ohio talked about making a provision for a medical procedure where you take an ectopic pregnancy and reimplant it in the uterus, which is not even a medical procedure that exists. And by mentioning it, they almost seem to suggest that women could be punished for having ectopic pregnancies. And it just seems like it cuts both ways. Like at this point, we are where we are, and Roe v. Wade has been around since 1971, and
so this is why we have courts, right? I mean, no judge worth their salt would punish a woman for having an ectopic pregnancy. Like that case would come in, and the judge would be like, "No, I'm going to throw that out. Like that's ridiculous, and this law is stupid, and we should change it."
One would hope so, but I've heard enough cases of judges absolutely not worth their salt that I don't have that kind of faith in individual judges, especially if you're talking about tiny rural towns. I think it's good not to have so much leeway for interpretation.
That sounds kind of yeah.
Sorry.
Sounds like you're anti-rural town, Katie.
Well, okay, so I'm just trying to say that if you're talking about a jurisdiction where there's like 500 people total, so there's like one lawyer that could be chosen for the judge, there's not a lot of competition for that position. Sometimes it doesn't go so
all right,
well.
but that's why we have an appeal system.
It can happen in cities too.
This is why you can appeal to a higher court. Okay, if the small court makes a stupid decision, then you can just appeal it to a higher court.
Yeah, you can appeal to a higher court after you're already in jail, after you're already in prison, after you've already had your life messed up.
Sure, yeah, but at least there's a process for getting the law overturned, is what I'm saying. It's not just like the little small town lawyer gets to decide what the law is for everyone. Like that's not how
I'm just saying.
Well, this is legislators, right?
Yeah, I would rather leave less room for human error.
It just doesn't seem like it bodes well when especially a lot of these laws seem very what's the word? Sensationalistic and poorly thought out. It doesn't seem like it bodes well for civilization.
Legislators don't necessarily know anything about what they're talking about. This is obvious. Like we all saw the Facebook trial in Congress, right?
I mean, so I think maybe this is a libertarian argument, but like the question seems to me like, do we treat people as adults or do we treat them like children? Like, do we let people be moral agents and just accept the consequences of their actions? And I guess there's a lot of different layers of that. Do we just let municipalities just decide what they're going to do, and maybe at the expense of the individuals in that municipality, and then the counties, and then the states? Do we let Alabama have this this crazy law that tries to completely ban abortion? Do we just let that happen?
Well, another way to frame that question, if you want to talk about treating people as adults, would be to restrict governments from making crazy provisions on individuals.
Yeah, it's interesting because it gets this week into some really tricky questions. Like you get into moral relativism if you start thinking about it, or cultural relativism.
Yeah,
cultural relativism. being the perspective that you let each culture or region decide its own moral code and just like let things be how they'll be, or do you say no, there's universals that apply to all of us?
So
for me, I'm a supporter of that position just because, well, you can move to a different place if you don't like the laws in your place. So I guess maybe a lot of people can't do that, and maybe something should be done about that to increase mobility or something like that. But I think you should absolutely be able to, if you don't like where you live, you should be able to just go find somewhere where you do like the laws and go hang out with people who share your values. That's what people should do.
Different strategies for freedom. On the one
hand,
hand,
it's a whole big.
It's a whole big thing. Cultural relativism, though, that's an interesting point, especially when it comes to abortion. I think abortion is probably the issue, like the biggest culture clash, political issue in the U.S. because you really just have this divide of Republican, more Christian Bible Belt areas versus more liberal city areas, where one culture sees it as completely immoral, there's millions of babies being murdered, and the other culture sees abortion as completely, obviously, an individual human right, and you're regulating and trying to control women's bodies based on like some religious ideology that you're trying to impose on everybody else.
Yeah. And of course, the downside to what I argued earlier about cultural relativism is that then if you just let everybody have whatever culture they want, then you have these diverging cultures, right? People kind of get more and more, I'm trying to say, like the cultures become more granular, and the society as a whole becomes less coherent, and people become less united. And then outside influences can kind of just eat the system.
It also sacrifices individual rights.
Yeah, and there's a few arguments both consequentialist and first principle arguments you can make against cultural relativism. There's also like child grooming, the idea, child grooming idea, like if you're raised in a particular culture, and that culture is like pernicious in some way, it's a form of child grooming. So if you're like raised in a culture where, let's say, an extreme example, let's say child brides are common, and you're a girl and you're raised in that culture and that's just normal, then like, did you really consent to be a child bride? Is that really like your individual choice, or is it something that you were coerced into?
Yeah, you could even make it something that doesn't bring up the issues of minors, because there's the question of, can minors consent at all? But say you're raised in a culture where female subordination is normal, which is common all around the world. Like, this is a big debate. Should you just let people have their culture where women are supposed to be subservient and men are seen as the dominant ones, even though like a lot of women in those cultures, a lot of adult women will say, this is my choice. But the question is, how much of a choice is it really when you're raised with that ideology your entire lifetime?
Yeah. All right, everyone.
All right.
Been a fantastic conversation. I have to get to bed. But thank you all for coming. Actually, I'll give you one more burning question, one more burning topic that you think we didn't get to. Anyone?
I'm good. I think this was a really good discussion, and I'm glad that we had the chance to have it.
Yeah, this was really interesting.
Yeah, I know this could have probably kept going for hours, but tune in next time, Facebook fans, and hopefully YouTube fans next time.
Yes. Have a great night, everybody.
Right.
Thank you for joining us on the Multiversity. We hope you found this episode both mind-bending and enjoyable.
We can be found all over the social media space and at multiversitypodcast.com.
If you like this content, give us a like, comment, follow, share, or support us on Patreon.
Catch you on the flip side.